All right, you folks should be seeing an update shortly. If you are interested in reviewing any of our past recordings, we've actually had a couple of, well, more than a couple now, back-to-back governance calls, given, I think, some of the content that we were talking about and some of the challenges reviewing it during our normal bi-weekly schedule, given the working group meeting that happened earlier in January. So it's another governance call today. And so I think I can give a little bit of an kind of, for folks who weren't attending last week, a heads up of kind of where we sit. The other housekeeping item I just wanted to mention is through, I think, the last two governance sessions, we've been able to kind of collect questions, concerns, and asks for clarity that came out of the FAQ that was published after the presentation to our group. I think it was in December. So I've shared that through, I think it's the Contact Us, it's mechanism that's on the Info Central page. I guess on your end, Joel, can you confirm that you received that and just that it gets distributed to the kind of originators of the content? It would have come through a couple hours ago, but basically it's just consolidating the feedback, the questions, and the ask for clarity that we had, and into a kind of a single point to start distributing more formally, I think, to the teams working on that particular content.
This was an email that you sent out a couple hours ago?
Yep, just through that Contact Us form.
Oh, okay, I cannot.
Okay, well, we can also follow up afterwards. Why don't we follow up afterwards and see if it does come through to the powers that be? It is submitted, so just wanted to let people know there are probably, based on what we heard last week, we may have some answers already. There are others that, you know, obviously there aren't clear decisions on yet, and there isn't kind of that like the documented process for every piece that we've asked it for clarity on. So we might have to be comfortable with having some of the questions that we've asked and the clarity pieces, you know, filtering in as they're known. The other piece I wanted to just raise for housekeeping. So January kind of flew by and was a little bit of an unusual month for us, but we did decide and chatted with the presenter on the Pan-Canadian Fire Exchange spec. We originally thought we would have it rescheduled to the February 3rd, but had a conflict. So we're going to reschedule it mid-March, and there should be actually a little bit more inputs into it by then, so that the timing may be a little bit better to answer questions that the community does have. But for those of you that, you know, had seen we were rescheduling it to today, I just want to make sure that folks are comfortable with us, you know, slotting a date mid-March around our governance calls for that update. It was a community request for the presentation to be done. The two pieces I had on the agenda, just given, I think, that we've closed out the FAQs for now, and we had some, I think, discussion on this a little bit starting last week. It was a request by Thomas in the forum chat. I apologize, Thomas. I hadn't seen it before the call, and so it makes sense that we started to delve into it, but you know, we'll want some dedicated time around it. So potential item for discussion number one being, you know, continuation of our discussion around that must support replacement proposal. You know, it is a somewhat, I think, if we're going to start kind of digging through this and trying to understand it so that we could come to a decision on whether or not it was viable for us anytime in the near future, it's still a pretty technical topic. So, you know, I want to be able to give folks the time if they want to talk through it today. Otherwise, I think, you know, in trying to continue our community discussion around baseline core, I think that one of the pieces that we started to chat through last week was around the definitions and what's going around, what's happening in the kind of national IG space and in the international council space. I want us to start constructing kind of our community response to some of those definitions to prepare for that, and to talk through what some of the implications are on some of the impacts that we've raised around the baseline and how it relates to other guides in our community. So before I dig into either one of those topics, my first question is there anything that folks want to see on the agenda that they don't see there right now? Okay. If not, is there a preference for which of these that we want to dig into first?
Well, in my mind, the baseline core is more of a governance thing than the must support. And more support is a more technical thing, and it's fairly early days in the international discussion. Although I'm happy to talk about either of them, but that's just my first reaction looking at it.
Anyone have any problems with that if we jump back into our discussion around this baseline core? All right. So I think reflecting back on some of what's been said over our last few governance calls, specifically around like confusion and concern around this idea of a baseline, having a expiration date, and this idea of a baseline not having a definitive claimed relationship to some of the guides in our community. I thought it would be helpful to start trying to think through some of these questions as a group. We are implementers, not just of the CA baseline, but we're also implementers in our own guides community. And I want us to really think through what our statements mean when we say, well, something has to be a parent or derivation point, and what the benefits and risks of that are for us as a community, but then also for us as implementers who have to live with, the consequences of any given structuring. And so I've got a couple questions on this front for us to start thinking through, if we're going to be presenting kind of our own thoughts as a baseline community through that national IG discussion to try to kind of promote what we think makes sense for how the baseline has a relationship into all of this, and promote our structure and approach to date. I think that we have to really thoroughly think through what that potentially means before we actually go in and say this is kind of not just how it exists today, but how we as a baseline community and implementers off of it would want to see things. Because I think the more we unpeel this onion, we get to questions like, does our expectations around our approach, do we need to think outside just the national and regional level, right? I think we're all thinking, how does this change in our community impact us as, regional or direct implementers? But there's also more and more impacts that are starting to come up in the universal realm space as well. Like as we start to formalize around definitions and around how guides relate to each other in a given region, that can make it easier or harder for a universal implementation to enter into the fray. So I want to just start talking through these. I think in the interest of kind of consensus and making sure that we're also allowing for, more organic discussion, are there questions related to this space that you don't see here that you want to make sure that we cover today? Are they a fair kind of expression of thinking through the impacts of some of the concerns that we've had? I ask that because there's some like here, right? Like, is there a future where it's no longer needed? Why and how is endorsement mutually exclusive? These are very clear concerns I think that folks have raised, and I think we want to make sure we at least start expanding on them more beyond just kind of initial reactionary statements that we've been able to get to date.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand what the last one means.
So this last, sorry, was that? No, okay. So the last one is a question in response to, I think, Randy last week had raised challenges that we have with where we're currently at in the baseline for asking for endorsement when there's still some obviously nebulousness for what our relationship to other national guides might be, and some confusion or lack of distinction around what the amount of effort that a jurisdiction would have engaging in their endorsement of the baseline versus engaging in endorsement of an alternative. And I know, Lorraine, you've raised in the past concerns around, already starting to use it in some of your guides, and there being that kind of communication challenge around what do we say to folks now if there's going to be a more restrictive, a more prescriptive guide that's coming out.
Okay, yeah, because we're trying to be succinct on the slide, sometimes it doesn't all fully come through. Thank you.
So should we just dive into the first, I think, two, or do we want to focus on the last two?
Have we come to consensus on what is the relationship between core and baseline?
No, not in this group, nor in the international space.
So yeah, so the first one, it's a little bit hard to dive into the detail if we don't have consensus on the difference.
So we did review last week, I think we kind of skimmed over the slides that that Ron presented to International Council describing the two.
Okay.
And
Okay,
so
yeah. I've seen those, yeah.
Sorry,
and I missed last week. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. And for folks that haven't, right, or that haven't seen these as well, they're in the own cloud. We're hoping to get the verbal from Ron. He's away at the moment, but it's these questions are largely coming out from this distinction slide that talks a little bit about, it's actually this distinction slide. Right, hold on, sorry, this one. They all look very similar. Of, baseline being this focus around concept representations, it being use case agnostic, and this starting point language that you used. But currently the proposed definitions includes, this reference to a formal relationship mechanism between the two.
Okay, yeah, so core is derived from the baseline.
Yep, and again, these are, I think, what's been proposed. I think we as a community also have to start thinking through what these pieces would mean for us, both benefits and risks. So I think we've chatted as a community about this concept where, if we're looking at national trends, cores typically start small and they add on and layer with versions and versions and versions as, additional concepts are added into their parent models, and that they are not always fully comprehensive to all various use cases, but there's typically a use case in mind. And so right now, these are kind of generalizations about what's seen in our community, except for this particular piece. And I think this is the net new that if we're going to respond, we have to think through. So if I just jump back real quick to the questions that we have. So when you've been thinking about the baseline and your both implementations, right? Because I think all of us represent the mores here, as well as how it would relate to other types of national guidance. What do we see as the benefit from our perhaps community perspective to making an argument for a formal derivation? And by that, we're talking about like reprofiling, No one? Okay, maybe we'll jump to risks. I'll get us started. So really quiet group, guys. So one of the risks that we talked about before is that whenever you introduce formal reprofiling, that if the guide you're reprofiling off of isn't stable, that it introduces potential points in which you will have to kind of continue to sync back up and evaluate the choices of your parent guide. So a risk as a more is some degree of instability.
Yeah, and it depends upon if you derive off the current or a specific tagged version.
So maybe we should separate them then.
Yeah.
So if using, let's say, Lorraine, the challenge that you raised in BC, that was deriving off of the current, correct?
Yes, because something happened and then things fell apart and we had to go back, right?
Yep. So if using the most, if reprofiling off of the most current, around instability, or I'll just say bugs. Because a lot of times, I mean, we're starting to experience that too, right? And that's just part of the trial process, are inherited downstream. And require, I don't know, Lorraine, if you folks talked about what it means if we were to change something in the baseline, if you're tapping into the most current, that you haven't had a chance to evaluate as a rule.
Yeah, well, and some of it depends upon if you change something that means we're no longer conformant, or if you change something that's more optional / conditional, right?
If changes bring your implementation out of conformance. So an example might be if we made a rule that necessitated something you didn't care about in the BC provider location registry.
Mm-hmm.
If you're using a version, let's say 1.00, you obviously miss out on some of this kind of instability and bugs, and you can get this maybe installation from having immediate impact. But I think this piece is still true, right? Like if you were to say, okay, we're going to now look at the baselines update to 1.0.3 or 1.0, or in the future 1.1. It still requires some degree of review to ensure that nothing would be introduced that you'd carry over that you don't want.
Yeah, although that's sort of standard software change management.
Yep.
You make a decision about when you move forward in versions, right? And on dependencies.
Anyone want to pitch in a benefit to asking folks to, trying to tie our formal derivation, or trying to tie the baseline into what would be required to be formally derived from?
Well, if we're at least at the in the core elements consistent with each other, that's going to make it easier for implementers and vendors who are trying to implement our implementation guides. Because I don't think any of us want to end up in the 13 different subversions phase that we were in V3.
So is this a fair, and I can actually make that a bit bigger. And is
I
this,
don't,
go
I
ahead.
don't want to be the only one talking, so.
I know, yeah, folks who, I mean, speak up, otherwise we really
Or-
don't have something to contribute.
Speaking up when it's different, but yeah. I see the benefit in there having that baseline as setting, the really core common things we need without any kind of specific use case, just saying for Canada, we need this. Whereas I see with the core model following like the US core, what they're trying to do is create a model for each different use case in there. And if that's the approach they're doing with our core, then really the baseline serves as the foundation for everything that the core builds on top of it. So it's kind of gives us a starting point for anybody who, while they may not want to use Canada core, they can start at the baseline and still be mostly compatible, if not entirely still.
So tell me if this is maybe a incorrect way of shifting the framing of that. Is it allows for folks whose use cases or who aren't covered by the use cases of other guides to have a starting point?
Have a common starting point.
Okay. What else?
As long as they're used to actually build the Canada core use cases, then it'll mean everybody stays more or less fairly common as much as reasonably possible.
So this being independent of whether or not a core or use case driven guide derives or uses the same concepts.
I mean, you look at BC right now, they're building stuff because the Canada core doesn't exist. So they're going to use the baseline to build from. And I can see anybody else doing that. If you don't have the Canada core piece done for some domain you're looking at, it's better if we have at least the baseline to say this is what the direction we're going in. And so that you can stay somewhere closer. And as long as core builds from that baseline, things will stay relatively close. I mean, yes, there will be differences because everybody's customized a little bit, but
Well, yeah,
as
and
long as it's closer.
we each pick a different spot that's a business priority to start at, for instance.
Exactly.
So I spent a bunch of time rereading the Ontario e-referral guide this week, because BC's looking at some of the things that touch on that space, but they focused on the exchange of information in the actual referral workflow in that guide, really, and just had some conceptual pieces around things like the relationship to provider directory and to human services directory, where BC's more thinking about the provider directory and human services directory pieces. So they're working on different parts of the use case. And so there's that danger as we approach it from different angles of coming at things really differently if we're not careful. And we're really, really trying hard not to do that. But that danger certainly exists because we're picking different pieces of scope as we do our project based on our own business priorities.
So is this like the benefits like avoids by being use case agnostic, it avoids those potential risks?
Oh, that's
It
a good
helps
question.
mitigate them. I would
I
say it
think it
helps
helps-
mitigate.
Yeah, I think it's a start. It doesn't avoid them, but it's a start.
When implementers review each other's work.
Because right now we're trying to coordinate based on reading each other's guides and making sure we make consistent decisions.
So how do we phrase this as a potential benefit or risk to those other guides, right? Of if the baseline, which is use case agnostic, is present, is it just another flavor of this? Ensures consistency of these concepts outside of just the lens of trying to compare to other guides that are demonstrating use case practices? Because this is like more, I'm reading this as like a generic benefit, right?
Well, it's more like an overall development benefit. I mean, if we can get everybody at least coming from a common foundation, that helps comparing, helps even adopting somebody else's guide or adapting it to what you actually need. Because if you're fairly common at the start, so we're all using the same definition of a patient, the 2 extra fields that BC needs that Alberta doesn't, and the 2 that Alberta needs and BC doesn't, become trivial. Because we'll all be using the same definition for the name, address, date of birth, and blah, 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 right?
Agreed.
So faster comparison between guides by removing need to compare or assess the claimed commonalities.
Hopefully.
I'm going to underline claimed here because I do actually think that ties directly into this idea of a derivation point, because, you know, we can look at patient and say, oh, I see modeling that's similar to what we do in the CA baseline patient profile. But if you can see something is based off of it, that will tell you off the bat, you know, you don't have to look for the pattern, you know, it's there.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about risks. So we talked about the risk of the one jump of, you know, we are still a very early maturity guide. It's a normal thing for us to kind of to run into bugs or make corrections or make refinements over time. What about the risks of folks that are operating? Let's say you're thinking about making this decision about building off the base, but you know you're operating and you're going to build a regional guide that will then be further profiled. Do we see risks there?
Well, there's always software dependency management risks, right? The risks around dependency management here are the same as in any other sort of software project. So
Are they compounded?
I just think they're what is. I do know that BC, like in one of the versions that BC published in one of their guides, they grabbed a version of the guide of the CA baseline that they depended on and put it in GitHub just to make sure if something happened to the Canadian source that they had the source to reference. For instance, I mean, so I guess one of it is the confidence in the management of the source and the availability.
So let's talk about that a little bit more, because so some of it is about confidence is all about control, right? So if you knew it was something that BC was producing, you would know you'd have a way of getting at it if something ever went offline, or, you know, contributing back if you found something that just didn't work for you in a following release. So it may be that the risks don't become exponential the more layers there are, but the governance of each of the layers being distinct from each other, I think would introduce less confidence in your ability to control the outcome, right?
Well, yeah, and we still don't really have clear guidelines around the governance decision-making of the different layers. Because we're still trying to work that out, right?
Yeah. So if we played it out, right, even if if we play out, like, we've got the CA baseline, right now we're a grassroots group that receives feedback from the community, reviews it as a group, makes decisions, makes the changes as we have time. In BC, you've got a regional guide. It's over the we'll make up a fake one because actually I think this one, the asset one, is a little bit more straightforward. let's say in BC, you've got a regional guide that wants to derive off the baseline. And you also expect, in your various, jurisdictions or health authorities, subsequent implementation guides to be developed that speak to the specific systems that are implementing additional expectations. That's 3 layers of different acting decisioning bodies. And the one at the top is still a grassroots group that gets to have a much less formal process for making changes and making decisions, right? That may
Yeah,
be one of,
that's always a concern.
yeah. Have different, let's say. That the most downstream guide doesn't have control over.
Because the ministry has the decision making over the provincial jurisdictional guide.
So do we think that this 3-level example is something that incurs a specific risk given our baseline approach? Like I mentioned, us being this grassroots, but maturity also comes into play. Is it more adequately put here? I guess what I'm asking is, if we were a base and we didn't operate under the limitations that we do today, would this still be as much of a challenge as it is, or is it a risk and a challenge more so given who we are and how we operate?
I'm kind of thinking that this kind of an issue would be mitigated a bit by, in theory, you would have the same group governing the core and the baseline. So at least those 2 would be the same one. And then the jurisdictional implementations would obviously have whichever jurisdiction has to govern their implementation.
So what parts of this would get mitigated if it was the same group?
Well, then at least you'd have the same people making the same kind of objectives, I think. I mean, if we don't have, how would we have a completely different Canada core group versus Canada baseline group? I mean, it'd be really hard not to have commonality in the ideas there.
Yeah, and uncertainty over how the community participates in making sure the decisions work for the various parts of the community is, I think, one of the challenges between what we have between our baseline and national guides.
You might find down the road that people start looking at, why should the baseline have jurisdiction over stuff that Canada Core does? Because baseline is a grassroots group and Canada Core is some specific
Formal group.
way governance, formal group's
Yeah.
the word. And so that may, cause issues for even adopting baseline anywhere.
So let's say as national guides become more and more formalized and adopted, that we run the particular risk for us with folks not wanting to derive off of the base.
I actually think the challenge is the other way around. The acceptance of the national guides, if the community doesn't feel like there's community consensus on the national guides, they'll ignore them.
Is it distinct, I think, from, Randy, will you repeat what you said before? So because I want to keep it still baseline focused.
So I was just saying that as a Canada Core becomes formally governed and everything, the kind of community-based governance of the baseline may lead some levels to not entirely trust that.
Mhm.
So it was the same as what Lorraine was saying?
Well, it's kind of the opposite. She's saying too that the community, if the communities embrace the baseline and whoever's running the governance of Canada Core hasn't embraced that, it can also cost credibility to Canada Core. Because why wouldn't the community embrace it if it supposedly is better, whichever term you want to use for the Canada Core governance of it?
And I think
Like-
part of that would be, the fact that it is developed and being endorsed by Infoway as a national standard, whereas baseline has always kind of had a nebulous position in what its mandate is, under what auspices under us operating, and where is the stick and carrot for baseline versus core.
So what do we think about this? You talked about carrots and sticks. I put auspices, participants and auspices being different between the two. I don't know if we can, like, does incentives being different between the two factor in here? Or is it really just about like challenges in optics and credibility between both the guides, given that, we're not coming at this from the perspective of XYZ group that has created this and has a formal governance process?
I don't think it's incentives yet.
Mhm.
At this stage. I mean, it's not like the V3 days when Infoway was paying jurisdictions to implement standards, right? And there was money involved if you implemented. Right now, we're all still focused on the good of the community and making sure that we have a consistent approach so that we get actual interoperability.
And so I want to spend just a little, look, anyone have any additional comments on these two pieces? I'm just going to actually.
I do think the fact that we're in early days, relatively speaking, means there's a lot of shift going on.
Mhm.
And that's just a fact of life.
I'll quickly chime in that, as we've been updating the Ontario patient summary with the new PSCA version 1.0 package, upgrading from 0.3, and then having PSCA 1.0 being derived off of the International Universal 1.1 IPS. Trying to track all those changes and incorporate and document them all for our changelog has been a very onerous and exhausting process. So all those layers, when you're trying to document, what's changed to convey to our adopters, and to have all that information in one place becomes very difficult.
So that an implementation guide has to.
Verify and document. Adhere to, yeah. And that's also why I've been slow in getting back to you on some of the PSA stuff.
It's the documentation piece, I feel you. So it creates additional burdens for the managing implementation guide. If, like, would you say the more out of, well, I don't want to say out of sync, but the more distributed the various guides that you have a relationship to are in terms of like the acting bodies, the governing bodies, the expectation?
That's right. Yep. I would agree. Thanks.
Yep. So I'm adding this into this kind of follow-up question, which is like, is any of this impacted the more we try to layer in additional considerations like universal realm guides? Okay, multiple layers. So Ken brings up a really good point, and it's one that is going to probably be a theme of this year, based on what we heard in the working group meeting and the challenges that universal guides like IPS and IPA are having when trying to figure out how they fit in with bases. So there's a clear relationship when you have a national specification that's oriented around executing off the domain, and you are, rebasing or building off of a domain-based universal guide. It's like IPS and PSCA or IPA and the other guides that come from it. The challenge is when we try to figure out how guides that are much more abstracted, like national bases and cores, are supposed to, or even regional guides, how they can claim relationships to both higher level universal realm and more abstract or agnostic national guides. There's not like an answer today. It's something that like we are asked to try to contribute to as we start to think through how we want to see these things show up in our community, and that as more and more guides are developed in the universal realm towards domains, this issue will compound if not solved. And I think last week, one of the things that I had pointed to was the initial modeling that the folks in the Netherlands have started to try to do to explain where they think like these layers fit. And I think what I take away from slides like this is that, even countries that have a lot of homogeny in their producing bodies that, for instance, in the Netherlands, create what is like their base and what is like their core, that there's still chaos introduced when we have to start thinking about how international IGs factor in. So for them, they're trying to figure out, is it right for an international realm domain guide to ask me to base off them, or is it supposed to work the other way around, where I take your rules, I apply my rules, and I create something new? At least in Norway, the relationships, when you're thinking solely inside their nation, make sense, right? You've got your base resource that comes from FHIR. You've got their base profile that they developed in HL7 Norway. They have a national profile layer in some cases, and then they have the implemented profiles, like what you might provide to your particular implementing assets. And so we have to think, even if we were further along and we had a really clear clarity on what guides in our nation and region and cities look like, we have the opportunity to also try to figure out what does this configuration and how should it act if we know what's coming in terms of the international guides. And we know what it's like in Ken's case to have to try to fit those relationships when you're a middle level actor.
Well, the reality is that more consistent we can be with the international, the easier it is for our vendors to provide, what is the international standard, and then hopefully not have to adapt too much to our local circumstances, right? Because one of the things we don't want is trying to make vendors adapt to 13 or 20 or 50 different approaches.
And so that would harken back to if there is the ability for us to influence international guides, it makes it easier to live in harmony, right?
Yes.
One of the examples that's come up in IPA in the last 2 weeks, international patient access, which is still early in its maturity as well, but specifically looking at how it relates to national cores, is there is a use case in international patient access that speaks to the types of information about a patient that we can reasonably expect will always be there, like identifier and name. When cores like those in Finland look at that and they say, a name always has to be present, but that's not how our core works, because we need to allow for use cases where a patient accesses and wants to be anonymized. And so all the time, like what that creates is a challenge where a core has been constructed that has use cases that don't one-to-one relate to a universal realm. And the question remains of, do they stay out of sync, or do we start to try to kind of water down the international realm to make it work for everyone? And we've had to fight those own issues, I think, even in our own small little baseline, right? Which is how, ensuring that we had a process if folks were out of sync with the requirements to relax them and to water them down, given our principles.
Yes. And I think that's going to be an ongoing discussion.
Yeah. So I'll go back to this piece again, which is these amount of layers. With the risks that we talked about, right? And the benefits, consistency, like almost like a forced consistency, a really easy way to claim commonalities so that you get to rely on your tools for comparison more than your manual reviews or, you know, manual documentation of change logs if there isn't a clear inheritance relationship telling that story. Do we think there is more that we have to consider in this space if we're anticipating that it's possible that, you know, any number of these layers could come into play? And should that reinforce or make us reconsider a definition that requires formal derivation off of a base or a baseline?
And there's a difference between requires and encourages, right? So for instance, US Core has a process where if an implementation guide does not believe that the core profile is suitable for what they're trying to do, there's a process where you document it, report it, and get approval to deviate. So, so there's a, I guess, safety valve for when things don't work.
I like that safety valve process or safety valve.
And also the US Core is geared at very specific use cases, right?
I wouldn't say it's very specific use cases.
No, it is pretty specific. It's specific to the US CDI, but it's still any US realm implementation guide has to document why they're not using the US core profiles if they're not, and log a JIRA ticket, because actually they're trying to gather those tickets as input to considering creating a baseline that's more general than US core.
And the coverage for US CDI is still the concepts that are required. Well, I'm actually working back from the core for a patient that's accessing their own information, right?
No, it's a bit broader than that. Yeah, it's basically the concepts that are covered in most EMRs.
So Joni, does that answer your question?
It wasn't really a question, it was just a comment that core is aimed at very specific use cases, and I think the CA core is also going to be specific use cases as well.
Yes, but the thing is that the US Realm Steering Committee has made a rule that any US implementation guide, no matter what it is, needs to either directly use the US core profiles or declare the reasons why it doesn't fit.
So would having, let's just say, a similar safety valve existed,
Mhm.
would having that remove any of the need to consider these various layers? Partially remove some of the risk that's associated with having this many layers? What are folks' thoughts? I ask because the more and more I think about how big the stack can potentially be, and I hear folks having similar challenges with very large stacks of guides built on top of each other. The more I have to harken back to the options that we told people from the beginning would be available to them to describe their relationship, right? When we first started doing the technical alignment walkthroughs, we said there were 4 different options, right? That the tooling today allowed for. There may be more today and there may be more 6 months from now. But we knew that depending on both the maturity of the baseline and the attributes of our potential users, that may push people in different directions for how they wanted to align, but still get some of the benefits that we were pushing for. So, you know, we talked about informal alignment with a statement on your iGuide indicating what your relationship was, what profiles you had done the confirmation that you were informally aligned to. We talked about, you know, formal dependencies on content that existed in the CA baseline, like extensions, and the use of things like capability statements or implementation guide files to indicate your relationship if you consumed or built on top of the CA baseline. Formal reprofiling, which we spent a lot of time today talking through today about, like actually building on top of the baseline profile and carrying with it all of the existing expectations and constraints and all of the benefits from that. I'm trying to think, the 4th one I think was conformance testing, basically making an assessment using tools that we have to compare instances of your implementation that you know are compliant to your rules against the rules of the CA baseline to inform whether or not you were aligned. And I think we need to think through if we need to extrapolate that beyond just the one node that we've talked about today, which is a downstream guide that is based off the baseline. Because this is going to get magnified and magnified and magnified every time we add a layer in. Do folks disagree with that and think, you know, we should still be kind of trying to push for formal derivation, or do we think that we need to look at, you know, the other options that we provided to downstream users and look at applying those upstream? For folks who don't know what I'm talking about when I say the technical alignment deck, let me just pull it up real quick. So when we started to socialize and develop a deck for endorsement, we also wanted to provide a set of materials to technical resources to describe, if you were writing an iGuide or a profile, what options you had available to you to demonstrate a relationship and alignment to the concept and expectations of the baseline. So I think it, you know, even, I don't know, what would that have been? A year ago, even longer than that, we had this idea that there might be more than one way to skin this cat. And that would be important for folks, even just one jump away from us. Are folks resistant? I mean, is there a reason we should be resistant to considering these as well when we think about what our relationship to a core or another national guide might be?
Yeah, I'm definitely less resistant to this than a formal derivation. just particularly as, we're still trying to fully define core versus baseline and exactly understanding what the use cases are for both of those.
Yeah, so we started with informal alignment, just trying to be consistent, like 2-3 years ago, as things were still pretty fluid. I think we might have jumped to actually reprofiling too soon because things aren't quite as solid as they are. But I mean, the ultimate goal was to be, and actually the difference between iGuide dependencies and reprofiling, I think, is a little bit murky to me. But reprofiling, once things are stable, is actually probably the ultimate goal. Whether we're ready to do that now is the question. But then, because now that we're now dependent on the baseline, and we don't know what's going to happen with CA core, did we make that dependency too soon? I don't know.
Well, we always said to folks when we started to circulate this, that, it makes sense to try to, if you're going to like think about reprofiling, to do it under certain cases, which is you're confident in the stability, you're not going to have another downstream guide below you, and or you're looking at it from a conceptual standpoint, you're doing it in things like test and, non-production environments, basically, that would have much less risk of change over time versus a production environment. So,
well, one of the things is there's a political layer over top of this, right? Because the ministry does want to be able to say that they're consistent with what the Canadian standards are.
mhm.
And while there's potentially some adjustment for the local circumstance, they're not out of sync with what's going on nationally, right? So the political push to actually formally derive is strong.
Do you think that that is something that is resolvable, like that changes slightly with education?
Well, it may, but that's a long-term education thing.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, derivation gives us a really quick, like it's a fast and cheap way of showing that, but it comes with costs. Cheap in some ways, not cheap in others. So what do folks think? I mean, does it make sense? We have, obviously more questions to arise in this space. One of our upcoming governance calls to really go back to our basics, look at these, discuss if there are other mechanisms that we know of, and think through what might make sense to try to position or make a recommendation, either as a replacement or an addendum to what's being proposed for these definitions to the core and baseline that start introducing mechanics. Or are you like, Sheridan, I'm tired of you talking about reprofiling. I just never want to hear about it again. So it is the latter then. Okay. I think at least at minimum, we need to talk maybe at the next session around these two things. We've got to talk through what these fears are and, what are the considerations and ways to avoid the scenarios that we're building up in our head from happening. So maybe, does it make sense to start with these and then spend time returning back to what are our options? Do we need to look at making a different recommendation for the definition?
Yeah, those are good topics. I like those.
Okay. All right. All right, so I'll end it on housekeeping as well. I'll stop the recording and you guys can access it via OwnCloud if you want to return back to it.